As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me.
What if the most dangerous threat to the British monarchy in 2026 isn't coming from outside the palace walls, but from within them, quietly unfolding behind closed doors where loyalty, power, and survival are colliding in ways the public was never meant to see? Because what we are about to uncover is not just a story of succession, it is a moment where the future of the crown itself is being reshaped in real time. The tension began not with an announcement, but with a pattern, subtle, but impossible to ignore. In recent appearances, King Charles III has looked increasingly fragile, his movements slower, his expressions more strained, and his once steady presence now carrying the weight of visible exhaustion. For a monarch who spent decades preparing for this role, the reality unfolding before the public eye feels almost cruel. And here is the question that immediately follows. When a king begins to falter, who decides when it is time for the crown to move forward? Because behind the historic walls of Buckingham Palace, that question is no longer theoretical. It is urgent. It is active. And according to emerging reports, it has already triggered intense, high-level discussions among the most powerful figures within the monarchy. The possibility of an early transition, something rarely spoken of so openly, is now being considered with a seriousness that signals just how critical the situation has become. At the center of this potential shift stands Prince William, a figure who has quietly evolved from a future heir into a man who may be called upon far sooner than expected. No longer just preparing, but potentially stepping into the role itself. And beside him, equally significant, is Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose composure and public image have positioned her as a stabilizing force in a time of growing uncertainty. But here is where the tension deepens. If William and Catherine rise early, what happens to those who still hold power today? Because no transition in the monarchy is ever just about succession. It is about influence, identity, and control. And this is exactly where Queen Camilla enters the story in a way that is far more complex than many expected. Publicly, she maintains her calm, composed presence, standing beside the king as she always has. But behind that composed exterior, there are increasing whispers that she is far from willing to step aside quietly. So ask yourself this. When someone has fought for decades to secure their place at the heart of power, do they simply let it go when the moment shifts? Because insiders suggest that what we are witnessing is not passive acceptance, but the early stages of resistance. A quiet, calculated effort to preserve influence in a system that may be preparing to move beyond her. And if that is true, then this is no longer just a transition, it is a power struggle. Now, as this internal tension builds, another figure begins to emerge from the shadows, someone who has never chased attention, but has always commanded respect when it mattered most. Princess Anne, often described as the most disciplined and duty-driven member of the royal family, has remained largely silent throughout this unfolding situation. But silence, in her case, does not mean absence. It means observation. And here is where the narrative takes a sharper turn. Because whenever the monarchy faces its most critical moments, and is rarely a bystander, she is a stabilizer, a strategist, a figure who understands the institution not as a symbol, but as a system that must be protected at all costs. So now consider this carefully. If tensions are rising between Camilla's desire to maintain influence and the growing push for William's early ascension, where does Anne stand in all of this? Because if she chooses to act, it will not be emotional. It will be precise. And it will be decisive. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere has reportedly shifted into something far heavier than routine uncertainty. Meetings that once carried ceremonial formality now feel like strategic briefings. Conversations are no longer about appearances, but about outcomes. And every decision carries consequences that could redefine the monarchy for an entire generation. Picture this moment clearly. A private room. Heavy curtains drawn. Documents spread across a polished table. King Charles III seated, not as a distant figurehead, but as a man facing the reality that his reign may not unfold as he once imagined. Across from him, Prince William, composed, observant, and fully aware that the weight of the future may arrive sooner than expected. No raised voices. No dramatic declarations. Just silence, punctuated by the quiet turning of pages and the unspoken understanding that history may be shifting in that very room. And then, a voice breaks through. Queen Camilla, not emotional, not reactive, but controlled, measured, and deliberate. She does not argue loudly, she reframes the situation. She speaks of stability, of tradition, of the risks of moving too quickly. But beneath those words lies something far more personal. The realization that an early transition does not just change the monarchy, it changes her place within it. So here is the question that cuts deeper than anything said aloud. Is this about protecting the crown, or protecting her position within it? Because in that moment, the room is no longer just discussing succession. It is confronting a conflict of priorities. The future of the monarchy on one side, and the preservation of influence on the other. William remains silent, and that silence matters. Because in the monarchy, silence is not weakness. It is calculation. It is patience. It is the understanding that the most important moves are rarely made in the open. The meeting ends without resolution, but not without consequence. Because once a question like this is raised, it does not disappear. It lingers. It grows. And it begins to shape everything that follows. As night falls over Buckingham Palace, the calm exterior of the institution hides something far more volatile beneath the surface. Alignments begin to shift. Loyalties begin to be tested. And strategies, quiet, calculated, and deeply personal, begin to take form. So now we move forward into the next phase of this story, where silence gives way to action, and where what began as a discussion behind closed doors may soon evolve into something far more visible, far more strategic, and far more dangerous for everyone involved. Because if you think this is simply about who wears the crown next, then you are missing the real story. The one where power is not handed over, but contested in ways the public is only just beginning to sense. If Section 1 exposed the tension, then what comes next is where that tension begins to evolve into something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and far more dangerous than anyone outside the palace walls fully realizes. Because once the question of succession is no longer hypothetical, it does not remain contained within polite discussion. It starts influencing behavior, shifting loyalties, and quietly redrawing the balance of power. So let me ask you something as we step deeper into this unfolding drama. When power is about to change hands, do people prepare for the transition, or do they fight to control it? Because inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere has reportedly shifted from concern to strategy. The advisors surrounding King Charles III are no longer simply monitoring his health. They are actively calculating outcomes. Charts, projections, and internal assessments are being reviewed with a level of urgency that suggests the monarchy is preparing for scenarios that, until recently, were considered too sensitive to even discuss openly. And this is where the story becomes far more complex, because these discussions are not just about timing, they are about perception. The monarchy, unlike any other institution, depends on the illusion of continuity. It must appear stable even when it is under pressure. So here is the critical question. What happens when that illusion begins to crack in front of the entire world? Because the recent public appearances of the king have not gone unnoticed. Every slowed step, every strained expression, every moment of visible fatigue has been dissected not just by media outlets, but by the public itself. And once the public begins to question strength, confidence begins to weaken. Which means the advisors are no longer asking whether a transition might be needed. They are asking how long the current situation can be sustained without risking long-term damage. Now bring Prince William into this equation, and the conversation takes on a new dimension. William is not just the heir, he is the solution being quietly positioned. A younger, more energetic figure who represents continuity without stagnation. But here is where the tension intensifies. Positioning someone as the solution inevitably creates a contrast with the current reality. So ask yourself this. If William is seen as the future, what does that make the present? Because that contrast does not exist in isolation. It affects how every member of the royal family is perceived, including Queen Camilla, whose position is directly tied to the reign of the current king. For her, this is not just about supporting a transition, it is about what remains when that transition happens. Influence, access, authority. All of it becomes uncertain. And this is where the narrative begins to shift from passive tension to active resistance. Reports suggest that Camilla is not simply observing these developments, she is responding to them, but not in a way that draws immediate attention. Instead of open confrontation, the approach appears to be subtle, strategic, and deeply psychological. Picture the setting. Private gatherings. Carefully selected advisors. Conversations that never directly challenge William, but gently question readiness, timing, and risk. The kind of dialogue that does not attack, but plants doubt. And here is the key detail. Doubt is far more powerful than criticism, because it spreads quietly and grows over time. So let me ask you this. What is more dangerous inside a system like the monarchy, open conflict, or silent doubt? Because while the palace operates on tradition, it also operates on perception. And if enough doubt is introduced at the right level, it can influence decisions without ever appearing as opposition. At the same time, this influence is not limited to internal conversations. The modern monarchy exists in a media landscape that amplifies every signal, every rumor, every shift in tone. And according to emerging whispers, external narratives are beginning to mirror these internal tensions. Articles questioning readiness. Commentary analyzing body language. Subtle critiques framed as objective observations. Now pause and consider this carefully. When internal doubt begins to reflect in external narratives, is that coincidence or coordination? Because if it is coordination, then we are no longer looking at a passive disagreement. We are looking at a strategy designed to shape perception before any official decision is made. Meanwhile, inside Kensington Palace, the impact of this shifting narrative is becoming increasingly visible. Prince William is not reacting publicly, but his awareness of the situation is undeniable. The scrutiny, the analysis, the subtle reframing of his actions, none of it goes unnoticed. And here is where the psychological dimension deepens, because leadership is not just about readiness, it is about resilience under pressure. So the question becomes, how does a future king respond when the challenge is not direct, but deliberately concealed? Because responding too aggressively risks validating the narrative, while remaining silent allows it to grow. It is a delicate balance, and one that requires not just patience, but precision. This is where another key figure begins to step into focus, someone who understands both the visible and invisible mechanics of the monarchy better than almost anyone else. Princess Anne has spent her entire life operating within the system without being consumed by it. She does not seek influence, yet she commands it. And when situations reach a certain level of seriousness, her role often shifts from observer to stabilizer. So here's the question that changes everything. If Anne decides that the situation is no longer sustainable, what action does she take? Because unlike others, she does not operate through suggestion or implication. She operates through clarity, through evidence, through decisions that prioritize the institution above all else. And this is exactly where the story begins to move toward its next turning point. Because if internal tensions continue to escalate, and if external narratives continue to reinforce those tensions, there will come a moment where observation is no longer enough. Action will be required. Now think about what that means. Not a public confrontation, not a dramatic announcement, but a shift behind the scenes, where information is gathered, alliances are reassessed, and strategies are recalibrated with a level of precision that leaves no room for error. Because in a system like the monarchy, the most significant battles are never the ones the public sees. They are the ones that determine what the public will eventually be told. So as we move into the next phase of this unfolding story, keep this in mind. The question is no longer whether there is tension, that much is clear. The question is who is controlling it, who is shaping it, and who will ultimately decide how it ends. Because once that decision is made, everything that came before it will start to make sense in ways that may completely change how this entire situation is understood. The moment tension stops being contained and starts producing visible consequences is the moment a quiet power struggle turns into something far more dangerous, because it means the conflict is no longer theoretical, it is active, it is evolving, and it is beginning to leave traces that cannot be easily erased. So let me ask you something as we move deeper into this unfolding situation. When a palace built on secrecy begins to leak signals of internal conflict, is that an accident, or is it the first sign that control is slipping? Because what began as subtle shifts in tone and quiet advisory discussions has now started to echo far beyond the private rooms of Buckingham Palace. The media landscape, which often reflects internal movements long before they are officially acknowledged, has begun to fill with carefully framed questions about leadership, readiness, and timing. Not outright accusations, not dramatic headlines, but something far more effective: controlled uncertainty. And here is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Articles begin appearing that analyze Prince William not as a future king, but as a subject of scrutiny. His composure is dissected. His silence is reinterpreted. His moments of fatigue are framed as signals rather than circumstances. At the same time, Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose public image has long been associated with grace and stability, is suddenly being evaluated through a different lens, one that questions whether elegance alone is enough to navigate a modern monarchy facing complex global pressures. So here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. When a narrative begins to shift this precisely, is it organic, or is someone guiding it? Because narratives like this do not gain traction without repetition, and repetition does not happen without coordination. The tone, the timing, and the consistency of these emerging critiques suggest something far more structured than random media curiosity. And if that is true, then we are no longer observing a passive transition. We are witnessing an active campaign to shape perception before any official decision is made. Inside Kensington Palace, the effect of this shift is immediate, even if it is not publicly acknowledged. Prince William is fully aware of how perception works within the monarchy. He understands that leadership is not just about capability, it is about confidence, and confidence is heavily influenced by how the public sees you. But here is the dilemma. How do you defend yourself against something that is designed to appear as neutral observation rather than direct attack? Because responding directly risks amplifying the narrative, while ignoring it allows it to spread. It is a strategic trap, and one that requires more than instinct to navigate. It requires patience, discipline, and above all, the ability to think several steps ahead. At the same time, Queen Camilla continues to maintain her carefully constructed public image. Her appearances remain composed, her tone measured, her presence reassuring. To the outside world, she appears as a stabilizing figure standing beside a king in a difficult moment. But here is where the contrast becomes striking. As William faces growing scrutiny, Camilla's image appears increasingly steady. So ask yourself this. Is that contrast happening naturally, or is it being quietly engineered? Because perception in the monarchy is never accidental. It is shaped, refined, and reinforced over time. And when one figure's image strengthens while another's begins to weaken under scrutiny, it raises a critical question about who benefits from that shift. This is where the situation begins to take on a more investigative tone, because beneath the surface, small inconsistencies start to emerge. Information that should remain contained begins appearing in unexpected places. Details about internal schedules, private meetings, and even training routines find their way into public discussion, often slightly altered, but recognizable enough to suggest a source within the system itself. Now pause and consider the implications of that. If internal information is being selectively leaked or reframed, who has access to it, and more importantly, who has the motive to use it? Because access alone is not enough. It requires intent. It requires a reason. And in a situation where influence is at stake, intent becomes one of the most powerful forces at play. This is exactly where Princess Anne begins to move from observer to participant. Unlike others, Anne does not react to noise, she responds to patterns. And what she is seeing is not random. It is structured. It is deliberate. And most importantly, it is escalating. So here's the question that shifts everything. When someone like Anne recognizes a pattern of internal disruption, does she wait for it to resolve itself, or does she intervene before it reaches a point of no return? Because Anne's understanding of the monarchy is rooted in one principle above all else. The institution must be protected, even if that means confronting uncomfortable truths. She does not operate through speculation. She operates through verification, through evidence, through action that is quiet, but decisive. And this is where the narrative takes a critical turn. Because once Anne begins to look deeper, the situation is no longer about perception, it becomes about source. Where are these narratives coming from? Who is feeding them? And what is the ultimate objective behind them? Inside the palace, a subtle but significant shift begins to take place. Movements are tracked more carefully. Communications are reviewed with greater scrutiny. Patterns that once went unnoticed are now being examined with precision. It is not a public investigation, but it is an investigation nonetheless. And here is where the tension intensifies even further. Because investigations, by their very nature, do not remain hidden forever. They lead somewhere. They uncover something. And when they do, the consequences are rarely contained. Meanwhile, Prince William begins to adapt. His approach becomes more controlled, more deliberate. He no longer reacts to every shift in narrative, he studies it. He looks for patterns. He begins to understand that this is not a random wave of criticism, but something far more targeted. So let me ask you this. When a future king realizes he is being tested, does he defend himself, or does he prepare to respond in a way that changes the entire dynamic? Because that response is coming. It may not be immediate, it may not be visible at first, but it is forming. And when it arrives, it will not be about perception, it will be about clarity. Now we are approaching the edge of a turning point, the moment where observation transforms into action. The pieces are moving into place. The patterns are becoming clearer. And the question is no longer whether something is happening, but what will happen when it is finally exposed. Because in the next phase of the story, the focus will shift from speculation to revelation. And when that happens, the consequences will not just affect individuals, they will redefine how power is understood within the monarchy itself. The moment an investigation stops being quiet observation and starts uncovering patterns that cannot be ignored is the moment everything changes. Because at that point the situation is no longer about managing perception, it becomes about confronting reality. And reality inside an institution like the monarchy is something that cannot be reshaped once it is fully exposed. So let me ask you this as we step into the most intense phase yet. What happens when the people tasked with protecting the crown begin to suspect that the threat is not external, but operating from within? Because that is exactly where this story now stands. What began as subtle media shifts and quiet internal concern has evolved into something far more structured, far more deliberate, and far more dangerous than anyone initially anticipated. The patterns that Princess and identified are no longer theoretical. They are aligning. They are pointing somewhere. And most importantly, they are beginning to reveal intent. Inside the inner circles of the palace, the atmosphere has shifted again, this time from tension to focus. There are no dramatic announcements, no visible panic, but there is movement. Controlled, calculated, and precise movement. Communications are being reviewed. Financial pathways are being quietly examined. Access points, who speaks to whom, who meets whom, who influences whom, are being mapped with a level of detail that suggests one thing very clearly. This is no longer about rumor, it is about verification. And here's the question that should immediately come to your mind. When an institution built on discretion begins to track its own members, how serious does the situation have to be? Because this level of internal scrutiny is not routine. It is reserved for moments where the integrity of the system itself feels at risk. And when that threshold is crossed, the response is not emotional, it is surgical. At the same time, Prince William is no longer simply observing from the sidelines. His role has shifted in a way that is subtle but unmistakable. He is no longer reacting to narratives, he is analyzing them. Every article, every headline, every so-called expert opinion is being examined not for what it says, but for what it reveals about its origin. So let me ask you this. When a future king begins to treat public criticism as intelligence rather than opposition, what does that tell you about the situation he believes he is facing? Because that shift in mindset is critical. It transforms the entire dynamic from defense to strategy. William is no longer asking how to respond, he is asking who is driving the narrative, and why. And this is where the investigation begins to tighten. Patterns of communication begin to overlap. Certain media outlets receive similar angles at similar times. Certain details, too specific to be coincidence, appear repeatedly across different platforms. And slowly, methodically, a picture begins to form. Now pause for a moment and think about the implications of that. If the narrative shaping is not random, then it must be coordinated. And if it is coordinated, then someone is orchestrating it. Which leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. Who inside the palace has both the access and the motive to do something like this? Because access is not widely distributed at that level. It is concentrated, controlled, limited to individuals who operate close to the center of power. And motive, in a situation like this, is not abstract. It is tied directly to influence, to position, and to what happens when the balance of power begins to shift. This is where Queen Camilla re-enters the narrative, not as a public figure, but as a potential focal point within the internal investigation. Publicly, nothing has changed. Her appearances remain composed. Her demeanor remains steady. But internally, the situation is becoming far more complex. Because certain connections, certain overlaps in communication, certain patterns of association begin to intersect in ways that cannot be easily dismissed. Not proof, not yet, but enough to raise serious questions. So here is what you need to consider. When suspicion begins to point toward someone at the highest level, how does an institution like the monarchy handle that without destabilizing itself? Because this is not a situation that allows for missteps. Acting too quickly without certainty risks internal fracture. Acting too slowly risks allowing the situation to escalate further. It is a narrow path, and one that requires absolute precision. At the same time, Princess Anne continues to push forward with a level of determination that reflects the seriousness of what she believes is at stake. She is not interested in speculation. She is focused on confirmation, on establishing a clear, undeniable understanding of what is happening beneath the surface. And here is where the tension reaches a new level, because once confirmation is obtained, action becomes unavoidable. So ask yourself this: what does action look like in a system where every decision carries historical weight? Because it will not be loud. It will not be chaotic. It will be controlled, deliberate, and final. Meanwhile, the external narrative continues to intensify. The media pressure does not ease, it grows. Questions become sharper. Analyses become more pointed. And the public, sensing that something larger is unfolding, becomes increasingly engaged. This creates a convergence of pressure that is difficult to contain. Internal investigation on one side, external scrutiny on the other, and in the middle, a situation that is moving steadily toward a point where it can no longer remain hidden. And this is where Prince William reaches a critical moment in his evolution within this story. Because he is no longer just preparing for leadership, he is experiencing it. He is making decisions that carry consequences. He is navigating a situation that tests not just his capability, but his judgment. So here is the question that defines this moment. When faced with evidence that could expose a serious internal conflict, does he act immediately, or does he wait for the perfect moment to ensure that the impact is undeniable? Because timing, in a situation like this, is everything. Acting too soon risks incomplete exposure. Acting too late risks losing control of the narrative entirely. And as this tension builds, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The story is approaching a breaking point. The investigation is nearing a stage where uncertainty will give way to clarity. And when that happens, the consequences will not be limited to private discussions or internal adjustments. They will be visible. They will be decisive. And they will change the way this entire situation is understood. So as we move into the final phase of this unfolding drama, keep this in mind. The question is no longer whether something will be revealed. The question is how that revelation will reshape everything that comes after it. Because once the truth steps out of the shadows, there is no returning to the version of events that existed before. And now we arrive at the moment where everything that has been building in silence, in shadow, and in careful calculation can no longer remain contained. Because when pressure reaches this level inside an institution as tightly controlled as the monarchy, it does not dissipate. It demands a decision that will define not just the present, but the future of the crown itself. So let me ask you this before everything unfolds. When truth and stability stand on opposite sides, which one do you think the monarchy will choose to protect? Because behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, the investigation that Princess Anne quietly initiated has now reached a point where uncertainty is no longer sustainable. Patterns have turned into connections. Connections have begun to form a structure. And that structure is pointing toward something that cannot simply be ignored or explained away. The question is no longer whether something happened, but how far it reaches and who it ultimately implicates. Inside a private council chamber, far removed from cameras and public speculation, the most senior advisors begin assembling. These are not figures who react to rumor or emotion. They are the custodians of continuity, the individuals tasked with ensuring that the monarchy survives moments exactly like this. And their presence alone signals that what is about to unfold is not routine, it is decisive. At the center of this gathering stands Prince William, no longer just the future of the monarchy, but a man stepping directly into the weight of leadership before the crown has even reached his head. His demeanor is not reactive, not emotional, but controlled in a way that reflects a deeper transformation. Because this is not about defending himself anymore. This is about protecting the institution that he is destined to lead. So here is the question that defines this moment. When a future king is forced to confront a threat from within, does he hesitate, or does he act with the authority of the role he has yet to officially assume? Because what happens next is not driven by impulse. It is driven by preparation. Evidence, gathered methodically, verified through multiple channels, and presented in a form that does not invite debate, but demands acknowledgement. Financial inconsistencies. Communication overlaps. Timelines that align too precisely to be coincidence. Each piece alone may raise questions, but together, they form something far more powerful: clarity. And as that clarity begins to unfold within the room, the atmosphere shifts. The quiet confidence that once protected certain positions begins to erode. The subtle balance of influence that defined the palace dynamics starts to tilt. Because once evidence enters the conversation, perception loses its power. Now consider this carefully. When influence is built on perception, what happens when perception is replaced by proof? Because that is the moment where control changes hands. Across the room sits Queen Camilla, composed as always, her posture unchanged, her expression measured. But composure, in a moment like this, is no longer enough to shape the outcome. Because the discussion has moved beyond image and into substance. And substance does not respond to poise. It responds to facts. So let me ask you this. When the narrative you have maintained begins to unravel in a room where every word carries weight, what options remain? Because denial, in such a setting, is fragile. It requires consistency, it requires support, and most importantly, it requires the absence of contradiction. But when contradiction is already present in documented form, denial becomes something else entirely: resistance. And resistance, at this level, does not just affect individuals, it affects the institution. This is where King Charles III faces the most difficult position of all. Not as a distant figure, not as a symbol, but as a man caught between personal loyalty and constitutional duty. Because whatever decision emerges from this moment will not simply resolve a situation, it will define how the monarchy responds to internal conflict in the modern era. So here is the question that sits at the heart of everything. Can a king protect both his family and his institution when the two are no longer aligned? Because history suggests that when forced to choose, the institution always comes first. Not out of coldness, but out of necessity. Because without the institution, the roles, the titles, and the legacy itself lose their meaning. As the discussion reaches its peak, something shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. The room begins to align, not through argument, but through recognition. Recognition that the situation has crossed a threshold where action is no longer optional. And here is where the outcome becomes clear. Not as a spectacle, not as a public confrontation, but as a controlled resolution designed to preserve stability while addressing the issue at its core. Influence is reduced. Access is limited. Roles are redefined. Not with noise, but with precision. Now pause and think about the weight of that. In a system built on hierarchy and continuity, even a small shift in position carries enormous significance. And when that shift involves someone at the highest level, it is not just a personal change, it is a structural adjustment. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, the public may never see the full extent of what has taken place. They will see the outcome, the appearances, the carefully worded statements, but the depth of the internal conflict will remain largely hidden. And this leads to a final, powerful question. How much of what shapes the monarchy is ever truly visible to the world? Because what we are witnessing is not just a moment, it is a transition. A shift not only in power, but in how that power is managed, protected, and, when necessary, rebalanced. As this chapter closes, one thing becomes undeniable. Prince William is no longer simply preparing for the crown. He is already demonstrating the qualities required to carry it. And beside him, Catherine, Princess of Wales, remains a steady presence, reinforcing the image of a future monarchy built on composure, resilience, and unity. But even as a new era begins to take shape, the echoes of what has happened will not disappear completely. They will remain, quietly influencing decisions, shaping relationships, and reminding everyone within the institution that stability is not something that can be taken for granted. So now we reach the final question, the one that brings everything together. Was what we have just witnessed a necessary act of protection for the monarchy, or a moment where power reshaped itself at the cost of something more personal? Because the answer to that question may depend on how you view the balance between duty and loyalty. If you found this story thought-provoking and want to stay ahead of every major shift inside the royal world, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. And before you go, take a moment to share your perspective in the comments, because your opinion is part of the conversation that keeps these stories alive. And if you think this was intense, the next video on your screen reveals an even deeper layer of royal power dynamics that most people never see coming, so don't miss it.